agile and swift aquatic predators. Some of these other embryonic traits that we can take a look at. It's an example of a yolk sac in vertebrate embryos. Again, vertebrates being animals with backbones. If we look at fish embryos, they have a yolk sac, and you're probably aware that the yolk sac is for holding nutrients during embryonic development within the egg and also shortly after hatching. Other shelled animals have a yolk, so a chicken embryo has a yolk, a snake, a turtle, all those organisms born in eggs have yolks. However, what's quite interesting is if we look at humans, now humans, our embryos are primarily nourished with the placenta. However, if we look at you, or if we looked at you early in your development, what we would see is that you too had a yolk sac. Okay? This is that linkage to our ancestry, which also made use of a yolk for nourishment early on in development. Our development has been prolonged within the mother to enable greater development and also greater development of the brain as well. So that is a great example of this linkage to our past as shown through embryonic comparisons. Now, one of the things that can occur through these developments is a structure called an atavism. Atavisms are when an organism reverts to an ancestral form. So here we can take a look at an example of an atavism. This is a snake body, and as you're probably aware, snakes do not have legs. But what do we see here present on this snake? We see that it has fully developed claws here, showing that its ancestors would have had those claws. Those genes present to produce claws on a snake are still present. It's just that they are not normally expressed. And in fact, an even more extreme example is here. This is another snake. Again, snakes typically do not have legs. So this is the belly, this is the head, here's the belly, and as the belly rolls over, what do we have sticking out right here? We have a fully developed leg. So we can see that it comes out, that leg has a joint, that leg has toes on it. So those genes to produce a leg in a snake, they're still present. It's just they are not normally expressed. And in fact, if this snake were allowed to exist out in nature, had not been identified and saved, allowed to grow in captivity, how would this snake likely have fared? Think about what would this leg have done to the ability of this snake to slither along. Well, it would have been caught on branches. This snake either would not have been as successful at capturing food, or it could not evade prey. So it would typically have been removed from the gene pool. So those are examples of what we call atavisms, when an organism reverts to an earlier ancestral form. Here we can take a look at another example. Here's a dolphin in which those hind limb buds were not reabsorbed. And what do we find on this dolphin? We find that it has these well-developed hind flippers. Now again, as we think about this, what effect would this likely have on the dolphin? Well, it's probably going to create greater drag, slowing this dolphin down. So it's probably not going to get as much food. It's going to waste more energy trying to keep up with its pod mates, and thus it's not going to grow as large. It's probably not going to get the same reproductive opportunities. Thus, those traits will not likely be passed on to future generations. As mentioned earlier, evolution selects for what works. It doesn't necessarily select for what is best. Classic example, as your book brings up, is the vertebrate eye. So here's the vertebrate eye right here. We might compare that to the eye of a mollusk here, so like a squid, octopus, or even a snail. Both of these eyes, you're going to have an outer cornea, You'll have an iris, a lens present, and then a retina. Now, these structures evolved independently of one another. The mollusci seemingly is a much better design, if you will. So for light to reach our photoreceptor cells, it has to go back to the retina. So here's where the retina is, and this is kind of a blown up view of the retina. It has to pass through the nerve fibers, interneurons, to get to the photoreceptor cells. Then that information has to be sent forward to nerve fibers to this, where the optic nerve goes back to the brain. And in fact, where that occurs, that is where we have a blind spot, where we cannot actually receive signals of the world around us. Now, there's some problems here. We'll see that the mollusci does not have a lot of these problems. Light comes in, hits the photoreceptor cells, and goes right back to the brain. As light's going through these, that light is going to be scattered. So you may not get as sharp of an image as a result of these extra layers that are present. Plus, realize there's also blood vessels out here, which will block some of that light. Now, is this the best design? No, but it works very well. I think you'd agree overall, aside from perhaps some nearsighted, farsighted issues, vertebrate eyes work very well. Also, realize that the retina is not fully embedded into the back of the eye. So what can happen is if somebody is in an accident, typically a high-speed car accident, the force of that trauma may cause the retina to detach and cause that retina to fold in the back of the eye, causing blurring of the vision, which would require surgery to correct. Maybe not the best, but it does indeed work, saying that evolution selects for what works, not necessarily what is best. Talking about the blind spot, realize that as light comes in, we have a blind spot that's present there. So for each of our eyes, if we were to cover up our eyes, there is actually a spot in our field of vision that we are blind to. And you're thinking, when I close one eye, I can see everything within that field of view. But what's actually occurring is your brain is filling in the information that is there. It's taking what you've seen previously and essentially photoshopping what you perceive. So our brains don't actually perceive the world as we see it. They perceive it as our brains interpret the world around us, which is kind of an interesting thing in that our brains don't actually show us necessarily the world as it is. One other example of an imperfect structure, we might think about the testes in males. So if we look at male humans or other male vertebrates, most male mammals, is that after birth, the testes have to descend because sperm cells need a cooler temperature to grow to maturity. If they're too warm of a temperature, they will not mature properly, and that can lead to sterility. However, if we look at where testes develop, they're going to develop way up in the body cavity, just below, right up, actually close to where the kidneys are. And in fact, this is where the testes are. If we were to, most semesters when we do lab, if we were to be dissecting, say, a pigeon or a frog, you'd see that the testes are up in the body cavity. So the testes have to descend through the abdominal wall. So they have to pass through the abdominal wall to get into the scrotum. Now, as they pass through the abdominal wall, typically after birth, then that's going to create a weak spot in the abdominal wall that males, if they go in for physicals, doctors are going to check for these hernias, which is a rupturing of the abdominal wall where that weak spot is. And in fact, males, I think, would agree that if you are hit in the testicles, you're quite aware of this, and that you may feel discomfort up in your abdomen. That's because those nerve endings began up in your abdomen area. So, because that's where your testes started out their formation. Not the best organization, but does it work? Certainly it does. And in fact, we could take a look at one other interesting thing about this before we move on. We're certainly aware that testicles are sensitive organs, and think about why, from an evolution standpoint, they are so sensitive. As an individual, a male is growing up, and if they're not cautious of protecting their testicles, and their testicles are damaged, what happens to their capacity to reproduce? Well, if the testes are damaged, then that can lead to sterility, which from an evolutionary standpoint, you can no longer pass your genes on. So there's been a selection for individuals to have high degree of pain sensitivity there, so that an individual protects their testicles so that they can maintain their reproductive capacity.